I completely destroyed my algorithm on several different platforms to make this video for you, so you're welcome. Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm a disability historian. I occasionally open Instagram, usually just to look at dog videos, and last week a lot of my colleagues started posting about some like influencer, YouTuber, or whatever who made a disability-related choice that caused a lot of backlash, and I very briefly thought about last minute covering it. I decided I did not have time, and then it kept like itching the back of my brain, so now we're here. To be clear, did not have time, do not have time, later Sydney problem. Now because this is going to be a very controversial topic the entire way through, of course mandatory reminder to be civil, normal people in the comments. Please. Also for credibility purposes, because again, this is a controversial topic, I am a professional disability historian. I have been for many years. I obviously do educational work around that on here. I also currently work in the theater and film industry to make sure that we're handling it correctly and ethically on screen and on stage. And I have a background in eugenics that somehow dates farther back than my disability media knowledge does, interestingly enough. I will say I did go to an old video on the history of eugenics to pull the source for this one, and some of my explanations in that video are unclear enough as to sort of teeter on misinformation, so maybe don't check that video out. That is on my short list to remake in the next 6 or so months, so stand by. I've grown as a science educator, but I am very qualified to be talking about this from a few different angles, so please don't be like, well, that's a young person and they're just disabled and so their opinion doesn't matter, because this is also my career. Also for friends who may need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length hair that's currently in a low ponytail because it's really warm out. I am wearing a dark blue button up that has some light blue feathers on it, and I am sitting on a dark gray couch in front of a plain wall with some green leaves and fairy lights up above my head. I also hand caption all of my videos, so if that's something that you would find useful, feel free to turn those on. And obviously content advisory for child loss, eugenics, and ableism. If you do not have the energy for that right now, that's super fine. Feel free to hop over to any other video on my channel. I recently released one about how your frontal lobe does not just stop developing at age 25. That might be more your speed. Okay, I think that's everything. I need water, hold up. Let's begin with the controversy, and then as quickly as we can take a far left turn to not talk about these two people and separate them from a much larger ethics discussion that's actually what is technically being centered here, because it feels a little unfair to just hang everything on these two people. This is functionally a case study for a wider conversation rather than we are going to talk about them and their decisions as much as I possibly can. It's obviously hard to separate a case study from it. Anyway, okay, so there's a YouTuber, his name is Ridgeway. His main channel is called McJuggernuggets, and he has about 4.3 million subscribers on there. He also has a personal channel that's a bit smaller, as does his wife Ashley, but on the main channel he became famous making content that was entirely, if not mostly, scripted, but it wasn't always clear if it was real or not, which majorly built up this early following. And then both his and his wife's personal channels are a bit more on like the vloggy side. The two of them announced in May that they were going to be having their first child and did lots of like gender reveal stuff. According to other sources, I have not actually been able to find the supposed gender reveal video people keep mentioning and describing places. Again, that's not the most relevant to the important parts of this conversation, so it doesn't really matter, but I am not a primary source on the existence of that gender reveal video. Specifically, I could not find it. At the end of May, they uploaded a video saying the results of their amniocentesis came in, and we'll talk about, that's a form of prenatal testing, we'll talk about that later. And it was confirmed that their unborn child was diagnosed with trisomy 21, which you likely know as Down syndrome. Trisomy 21 basically just means that somebody's genetic code has an extra, a third, where's the tri comes from, copy of chromosome 21, which causes things like difference in face shape, intellectual and developmental disability, usually a slightly shorter height, and can cause other kinds of differences throughout the body, like heart conditions and such, but it really, really depends on the person, as does everything. That's not unique to Down syndrome. It is the most common genetic disorder in humans, appearing in about 1 every 700 births, and it's Down, not Downs. It's named after John Langdon Down, who first described it in the 1860s, but it's not his condition, if that makes any sense, so there's no possessive. Same with Asperger. It's not Asperger's. Anyway, okay, about a week after the video they uploaded where they live filmed themselves opening up these results and being devastated and whatnot with this information, Jesse posted on his Instagram story that they made the tough decision to terminate the pregnancy. Specifically, he said, "This week my wife and I made the very difficult decision to terminate the pregnancy due to trisomy 21. The choice was not made lightly. We really appreciate all of the personal stories that you guys shared with us, especially the unconditional support we received from fans with no matter what we decided. I know some of you may be very disappointed to hear this news. We are devastated. This has been extremely traumatic for both of us, especially Ashley. She underwent the procedure earlier this week and is on the mend. Thankfully, everything went smoothly, but emotionally we are drained. Trisomy 21, also known as Down syndrome, is caused by an extra chromosome. It is caused by an error in cell division, like a glitch. The odds of a baby having it is 1 in 1,000. When I first confronted this news, I was shocked but optimistic. If they're a little slow intellectually, then we'll make it work. I signed on to be a parent, come what may, but I just didn't fully understand what Down syndrome entailed. Once we made it public, it became clear that most people don't know what Down syndrome entails, and no, it is not the same as autism. 50% of babies with DS have heart defects, 75% will have hearing challenges, over 50% will have vision problems, impaired immune function, developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, delayed physical development, poor muscle tone, structural issues with face, decreased lifespan, etc. Sadly, the list is long. Feel free to look it up. Down syndrome isn't a blessing. It is objectively shitty from a health perspective. I didn't realize just how rough it is for the child, let alone the family. More often than not, they would be fully dependent on others for the rest of their life. The miscarriage risk is also close to 50%, which made matters worse. They may never see the light of day, and it puts Ashley further at risk. We spoke with doctors, friends, family, and genetic counselors, and learned that up to 90% of women terminate their pregnancies after learning the baby has trisomy 21. This was way higher than I expected. I thought it would be lower given I hear so many say they kept or would keep the baby. I believe that's because most terminations happen privately. It feels shameful. A lot of judgment being cast. You never think you'd be in this type of situation until it happens to you, and then things change. To all of my fans who have weighed in on this topic who have autism, Down syndrome, or any other conditions, we appreciate you. You matter a lot and we're glad you're here. I commend you and your families for having the strength and courage to push forward. As for us, we made a difficult decision that we believe in the long run will be beneficial for our family. Thankfully, we had a choice. It will take a little time to move on, but we are excited to try again in the future and hopefully have a better outcome. Love you guys and thank you for understanding. And then the internet completely blew up, to a degree where even I saw it, which is impressive. But part of why that happened is because, first of all, the far-right pro-life folks saw a really public example that they could use to rouse a lot of big feelings on their platforms about these people being murderers who are going to hell or whatever, and they took it and they ran with it. If you go to YouTube and you try to look for any commentary videos about the specific event, nearly all of them are from outright or more covertly Christian, Republican, conservative platforms. The vast majority of articles and think pieces published about it are the same. So we have them making this story, not even the story, that feels unkind, this situation way larger than it needs to be, added to the fans of these people who feel some type of way about it in a lot of different directions. It's not uncommon for pro-choice folks to have a very different, or at least more complicated feeling once a fetus has hit a certain gestational age. And of course, there's also the disability aspect of this choice as well, which many people have feelings about, and the language and tone utilized in that Instagram story that is both very ableist and also a lot of it is outright incorrect. What seems to me as an attempt by the Ridgeways to just give a regular life update in the YouTube vlogger bad at boundaries with the public kind of way turned into them stepping into both the current political climate around a person's right to choose, intermingled with a debate that has been going strong for about 2 decades about termination due to disability and prenatal genetic testing. I've also seen lots of people theorize that this may be a whole scripted rage bait bit for the channel to get more attention. I don't think that's the case, but Ridgeway does find himself in a bit of a boy who cried wolf situation given his general content style, so that's just like an unfortunate side effect here. But it does raise the point that this isn't just 2 people sharing a thing that they've experienced with a couple people in their lives. So the Ridgeways have a really, really large platform and thus serve as media for a lot of people, which then bestows upon them the responsibility of choosing their words carefully because they have great impact. Much like we hope that our movies and our TV shows and our shows on Broadway are going to choose their words carefully about complicated, nuanced issues because we know that they're going to have a huge audience. That is also something that we would hope from people with massive platforms. Do influencers follow that or respect that responsibility? Very rarely. We know this to be true, but that does not make them any less technically responsible because that is the position that they are in as a piece of the large media canon, even if they do not realize it. I am more than sure that for many people looking at this Instagram story, it is the first time they're learning any more about Down syndrome than the fact that folks with it tend to look a little bit different and have some form of intellectual disability, which is usually where the general public knowledge tends to end. I honestly this is not a specific disability I have researched in a while. It doesn't come up that often in theater. It comes up a lot in film and TV, but I haven't looked into it in a while, and so I was like, I think that's right, but I feel like some of those numbers aren't quite correct. Like that, even I almost believed it because I was like, well, they've been researching it, so they must know and they must be correct. As somebody who, it's my job to fact check that kind of stuff. So what is a regular person who isn't even thinking about that going to think, right? Which makes it concerning when we see it described as an error and a glitch in fetal development rather than a difference or an atypicality. In the video about test results, he uses the word normal rather than typical on several different occasions. And I'm not expecting this random dude to be, you know, fantastically versed in all things disability language. You could argue perhaps this is a little bit of a nitpick, but that doesn't mean what he said wasn't still super harmful and has wide-reaching effects. In his post, he says that 90% of people who receive this diagnosis terminate. That's blatantly not true in the United States, where he does originate. I don't know who is telling him that. My only guess would be that he maybe pulled that from some of the coverage of this issue, both in the UK and in Australia. They both have around a 90% termination rate, but in the United States, it is closer to 74%. He describes Down syndrome as objectively really shitty from a health perspective and basically implies that a child will suffer for their entire life and it's better that that life is not lived, which might be a personal belief of his, but does have very wide-reaching consequences when it is said aloud. Also, everybody is dependent for their entire lives. There is no such thing as true independence. It just may look a little bit different for disabled people. And the whole statement just sort of comes across as, hey, we think this is the worst thing to ever happen to a child and it's not a life worth living. And we're so glad that we got to know beforehand so we could just avoid it. And, you know, every parent who chooses to keep their disabled child is really, really brave and really strong, and I commend them for that. Also, thanks to all of our disabled followers for being here. We really value you as people, which needless to say isn't great. Like, does not feel good. Now, all of that being said, did the Ridgeways do a eugenics? And the answer is no, they did not. And that criticism keeps coming up over and over and over again, and it genuinely makes very little sense. They may have acted on a eugenicist belief, which we're going to get to shortly, but that does not mean that they are eugenicists, and again, that doesn't make any sense. Eugenics, much like racism and misogyny and everything else, is absolutely baked into the very core of our culture, so I'm not gonna yell at a random dude from New Jersey for not having sat down and unpacked all of that and what it means. Not even I have unpacked that completely, and I have been knee-deep in eugenicist policy and research since high school. Don't ask, I don't know why. Eugenics is also not something a single person can really do, unless you're like Alexander Graham Bell, who spent a lot of his life creating and enacting eugenicist policies, or like Adolf Hitler, like they did a eugenics, but generally somebody making the personal choice to not have a disabled child is not them committing eugenics. It requires a system that controls who reproduces and what babies get to live, with a belief that some genes are inherently better than others, and through selective breeding we can make a better, fitter race of human. So some examples of that would include the time Alexander Graham Bell, yes, the guy who invented the telephone, tried to make it illegal for deaf people to marry each other. That failed, by the way. Or everything going on in Germany in the Second World War with disabled, queer, communist, Romani, Jewish, all other kinds of people being exterminated. Though notably, America tends to be like, yeah, Germany has eugenics, but we don't, and all of their policies did come from us. Basically everything specifically comes from American eugenicists, so that was our doing. I will say generally genocides aren't always eugenics, but they can be. That is a very complicated distinction. It really depends on the purported aim of the genocide. Another example of eugenics is the 1927 Supreme Court ruling of Buck v. Bell that allows any disabled person to be sterilized against their will in basically under 2 phone calls. It's really easy to do. This legislation has yet to be overturned and was utilized to sterilize 60 to 70,000 people in institutions in the mid to late 1900s, often without their knowledge, and is still utilized for that purpose today, though on a smaller scale. Preventing disabled people from being able to have children from a systemic level, that is eugenics. So to add to this, there are many cases of disabled people being actively discouraged by their doctors from having children, not because of the safety of them being able to be pregnant, but because of their genetic line or whatever. That is an act of eugenics. But that individual person making their own decision to not have a child because of their disability, or not, they might just not want to have children, that isn't eugenics. And then we get into the more morally complicated examples, like icon and legend Helen Keller's work in treating venereal diseases and early screening of newborns to cure the most preventable forms of blindness that nearly eradicated that in the United States. Same with more recent work around Tay-Sachs disease and certain people who know they have the gene for Huntington's deciding to not procreate. Those are more viewed as community health initiatives because they're not state sponsored, and I would agree with that, but ethically it can be complicated. And then of course we also have parents' choice to terminate a pregnancy after a disability diagnosis. So you can see where this line can be pretty fuzzy, and the line between personal choice and outside pressure and state-sponsored kind of things gets really, really complicated, and whether we can categorically say something is eugenics or isn't eugenics. But a person's individual choice to do something is categorically not. One of the most common places that we see eugenics conversations pop up today is specifically regarding CRISPR and designer babies and prenatal testing and how that is handled. Needless to say, it's a mess. If you do want to cross-check any of my sources on this matter, they are linked in the description, so feel free. I can't promise you it'll be a fun time. A lot of weird research papers for this, but basically, when a person is pregnant, usually the first round of testing done more generally for all kinds of things is what's called a serum marker screening, which is a simple blood test, and of course also ultrasound imaging that is used to see how a fetus is developing, all that kind of stuff. Now, because this test is done so early and it is just a blood test, it can sometimes flag things that may be false positives. So after that, there are other kinds of testing that are a lot more invasive that can be done, like CVS, which is chorionic embryonic villus sampling, or amniocentesis. And these kind of tests happen a lot later in pregnancies, the former usually around 10 to 13 weeks, and the latter after 15 weeks, which I specifically bring up because there's been criticisms of the Ridgeways being like, why did you wait so long? Which doesn't make any sense, because when you look at the gestational time in which they would have been able to have this test done to be sure of this diagnosis, that's just kind of when it was going to happen if it was going to happen, because sometimes things do get flagged as being a high-risk possibility, and then once you test more formally for it later, the results turn out to be negative. So that is the thing that happens. Now in 2011, a new kind of testing hit the scene called NIPT. Non-invasive prenatal genetic testing, which can be done as early as 10 weeks. I read a really long article about the entire history of NIPT from 2015, talking about what medicine kind of hopes from it and its positives over things like CVS and amniocentesis, because it is non-invasive, which means it doesn't come with potential risk of miscarriage like the other two do. However, over time, the handful of companies that offer versions of NIPT have been having it test for more rare things that it's significantly less accurate on and has caused a great deal of concern. There was a huge New York Times article about it that came out in 2022. I know they're not the most responsible sources now, but this is a pretty solid article and you can fact check some of the stuff within it, that laid out the data of accuracy for certain conditions, and it is rather stark. It also noted that many physicians are given these tests as tools and not told about things like false positive rates. So they are likely to present it to their patients as, this is what the result says, it is objective, it is a major chance this is the case for your unborn child, how do you want to proceed? Which is not ideal. Some physicians think that the NIPT should be used as a screening test versus a diagnostic test, but not everybody is a part of that discussion or getting all of that information when they're just being told, this is a test that we offer, here you should have it. Right? In general, the FDA does not regulate laboratory developed tests, which is what this one is, and that isn't necessarily a red flag. Nobody can really agree as to whether they wish that these were regulated by the FDA or not. Many other major inaccurate tests are also unregulated, so that is a very complicated issue. But because NIPT was rolled out fairly quickly and it can detect things a little bit earlier in pregnancy, a lot more conversations around the choice to terminate a pregnancy due to potential diagnosis have come out in its wake. Now, I don't want to villainize NIPT specifically here. I just don't know if the concerns associated with it also match up to the other prenatal tests we just talked about, because they're a lot older, so the discussions around them are less easy to find. So this will seem a little bit unbalanced, but that does not mean that they're inherently bad. It's just only due to the amount of information and discussion that has appeared about this specific test, because it is relatively new. Not because it's horrible, not because it's not horrible. This is meant to be neutral. You're just getting more information about this one than the others. Anyway, so one concern brought up about this is that because of this test's ease, it raises an important informed consent problem. It may be done without patients' knowledge of what the test is, or if it is information that they want to know. There are many cases of people having false positives with NIPT for one pregnancy and having that be so stressful and traumatizing that they opt not the second time around, for example. A parent may not want to have to make the decision about what they would do if they had the choice whether to birth a disabled child or not. And by doing this test without them realizing the full breadth of what it means, they might find themselves in that position unwillingly. There have also been questions about whether it should be even available in countries where termination of pregnancy is illegal, because it could greatly raise the risk of people trying to go and figure out how to do that on their own in an unsafe manner. We're already seeing some data that this is probably the case. I did find it incredibly interesting how many of the concerns around prenatal testing are specifically brought up in relation to pregnancy termination and in no other direction. Like, it's almost an assumed outcome or expected result of certain tests. But this article brought up the fact that some countries have outlawed the ability for parents to know the sex of their baby because there was such a high rate of people only birthing boys that it was completely skewing up the birth rate. India is a primary example of this. There's also often concern raised about NIPT's issues with false positives, creating situations where healthy fetuses are being terminated unnecessarily, which is an interesting quandary in itself, because are we then saying that disabled fetuses are being terminated necessarily? What does that phrasing imply? And that pops up in a lot of different places. I've seen that sentence in like 10 different articles. Quite odd. Lots to ponder in that particular front. But as you can see, a lot of the concern here boils down to A, should we perform this test? And B, if we do, how do we disseminate the results to parents? And it's the latter thing that, in my opinion, makes this eugenics, and is also the thing Down syndrome advocates and other disability advocates as well have been most trying to raise hell about. Because you can say science is neutral, it's just data on a piece of paper, but then when somebody says, okay, doctor, but what do these data mean for my unborn child? They are then asking the physician to interpret it for them and to explain what it means. And the physician is more often than not going to look at a list of deficits associated with a certain diagnosis and read them off to you as a checklist of all the things your kid might never be able to do and the things that they may struggle with. Because the diagnostic model for anything is, here is what is wrong, as the medical field is functionally goal-oriented to diagnose what is wrong and to fix it. And that leads to this medical view of things often catastrophizing situations a bit because it is viewed as a negative thing in need of fixing rather than a human atypicality or a human diversity kind of thing. Like if you were to turn gender into a list of deficits, right? If we were to say, oh yeah, well, being a girl means that she's gonna be in pain once a month and that's gonna be kind of debilitating to her, and she's gonna be, you know, treated differently by others. They're not gonna take her as seriously. If you turn that all into a big checklist and you read it out to somebody and that person hasn't met a girl in like 10 years, what are they going to come out thinking about that specific thing, right? We're coming at it with a specific bias. Now, I will say the medical field is rapidly doing a lot of work around trying to reframe things toward a diversity model, specifically around neurodivergence, to try to be less deficit oriented. But as somebody who has previously worked as one of the people trying to do that, it is an uphill battle. Old habits do die hard. And it's also becomes an interesting conundrum because it is hard to put a diversity model along with a fix-it model and figure out how to integrate those two things. It's something that people who are experts in disability advocacy work can usually hold concurrently, but cognitively for people who've only ever seen one of those sides, it is really hard to find a middle ground. So it just becomes a whole situation. Also, unless you're talking to somebody who is an expert in a specific field of diagnosis and stays up to date on their research all the time, they also might hand you pamphlets and or say stuff that is no longer entirely the case because things have changed so much in recent history. So you may be told information by the doctor that they're very sure about being true that is about 15 years out of date about something your unborn child may struggle with that now is a lot simpler and a lot more treatable than it used to be. Diabetes is a great example of something where care and ease of care has changed exponentially in the past 10 to 15 years. I firmly believe, because I had a classmate with diabetes when I was a little kid, that even up until today, they have to prick themselves 24/7 and constantly check their blood sugars and have that little lunchbox of all that stuff with them all the time. And then I met a bunch of people in college who have diabetes and I was like, wow, you just have a thing on your arm and you're still monitoring those things, of course, but it is a very different situation than it used to be. And I only know that because I met more people later, right? Diabetes is not totally applicable for this specific situation, but science is moving fast about lots of different medical things, and physicians are not going to have all of the time in the world to sit down and research academic articles about every single one of them to stay up to date on every single kind of diagnosis when they get home from the office. They are going home, they are writing notes until they fall asleep with their computers, and then they are waking up the next day and starting over. So if you're asking about a rare disease that doesn't pop up very often, the information shared with you might be a little bit out of date. This is the same for those of you who are taking abnormal psychology classes as a course in school. My professor hated me because I spent my evenings going through the most recent research on every single topic and then would question her accuracy in every single class. By no fault of her own, teachers are also overworked and underpaid and science moves fast, but it just goes to show how quickly things are moving. And specifically, when we're talking about research around disability and diversity, we have seen a huge boom of it in the last 10 to 15 years because as more people are graduating who grew up with IEPs, who then became more able to go to college, more able to graduate college and get master's, PhDs, all that kind of stuff. A lot of them are then doing research into their specific disability, and that is getting published. So we are seeing a huge boom in disabled point of view research being published, which is completely changing the game for like most disabilities that have a cultural element to them. It's been really fascinating in the last 10 or so years to see that happen. And also for somebody who is, you know, going to teach parents about every kind of congenital genetic condition, they may provide you with a lot of really scary seeming information about the worst case scenario, and you wholeheartedly trust they know more than you do because they are the physician and supposedly the expert, which categorically probably true about the specific topic. They do probably know more than you. I'm not saying non-medical people go do your own research and fight your doctor based on your own opinions from Google, because I strongly advise against that, but more that in these scenarios they aren't balanced out with anything neutral to positive just because of how the medical lens tends to look at disability. So even if categorically they feel like they're presenting it neutrally because they are presenting the scientific facts, it does not feel that way because the scientific facts skew negative by nature of how we classify things and what we research. And then if you go home and you start Googling this condition, it's not hard to find how parents of disabled kids in media tend to talk about them, which frames them as burdens and life ruining and marriage destroying and all of these things. And in that mix, there is never, or very, very rarely, the chance to actually meet with a family who experiences that disability or a person who experiences that disability to get a more nuanced and humanized view of all of it. And so you're going to form some pretty negative conclusions because you don't have anything else to go off of. You see 15 YouTube videos of moms talking about their disabled kids ruining their lives against one talking about how much their child is a blessing in their life. Of course, you're going to come out with a certain feeling about it. You also don't have it balanced out against how many people also feel like their non-disabled children are ruining their lives, partially because it is such a normalized discussion regarding disabled kids and very taboo otherwise, to balance this narrative out and realize that a lot of people have a really hard time being parents, regardless of the child's abilities or disabilities. And to be abundantly clear, there's literally no shame in that. Being a parent is really, really, really difficult, which might sound very silly of me to say because I am not a parent. But I was a service dog trainer for a while and a puppy raiser, which is not the same thing, and I know that, but it has a lot of similar elements, and it is exhausting and it is overstimulating, and there's a lot of elements of it that are very, very difficult. But then interestingly, the only times in society where we like
allow people to say that being a parent objectively is very difficult is in relation to disability. So it becomes really skewed online, even though when you actually talk to people who are parents and start asking around, it looks a lot different. Which I just find really fascinating.
There's also been the argument that by testing for something in the first place, we're already saying that it is bad and it is negative. We don't do expensive medical testing for the purposes of just for funsies. You could argue that this is partially just helpful. Like, it's helpful to know before birth that a baby might be born with a certain disability, because then you can immediately flag them as potentially having a heart issue that needs early monitoring, for example. But the majority of people don't seem to be viewing this as data collection for the future of a child. They seem to be viewing it as a decision as to whether a fetus is or is not viable. Now, I will caveat this to say that these tests also do tell you whether a fetus is or is not viable. There are certain things that lead to a child being stillborn or something else like that can also be tested with this kind of stuff, where it completely makes sense in like all scenarios to end the pregnancy because the pregnancy is already ending itself, if that makes sense. Like one specific case that I heard of recently would be like a child that they discovered literally did not have a brain, so was not going to develop to the end of the pregnancy, and it was going to be unsafe for mother and baby. That would be a case where, yeah, we are testing for the viability of the child. It gets a lot more dubious when we're talking about things that it's like, yeah, the child will be born, the question is what does their life look like? And that becomes a lot more of a really sketchy ethics discussion where we don't actually know.
Also, just to clarify, because I explained that sort of poorly, I'm not saying that actually termination at this point is only like allowed or like should only be allowed if the fetus is not viable. I am very firmly pro-choice, as we'll get more into as this video goes along. But specifically, some of these tests are about viability and if the child will even get to birth. And some of these tests are just, will they be different when they are born? Will they have disabilities when they are born? And treating those things as identical and having identical meaning raises ethics concerns.
But this creates a really weird scenario where, like, we don't know this creature yet. It is still growing. So you end up boiling it down to that diagnosis, to a set of symptoms and traits, because it's the only thing that you really know for sure about them. You have no other context, and it's so easy to spiral and catastrophize and wonder if maybe this isn't the right thing to do because you have very little information about who this child is. We see this in Jesse's Instagram story specifically, right? He just boiled this fetus down to a list of statistics, and that is how they understood the situation, and that is how they acted on it. And I don't blame them for that. You really don't know for sure what you're going to do in the situation until you're in it. And when you are just told a list of everything that is going to be awful about this, I understand why somebody might make a decision like that. But this also, of course, raises the question as to where this line stops, because the more we learn about genetics, the more we're finding different genetic differences people may have, different rare disorders that really don't impact their daily lives at all. What do we do with that information? To quote one article on the matter, singling out a condition by offering routine screening and enabling selective abortion sends a strong value judgment about potential quality of life. Trying to predict the future based solely on their genes opens the door to discrimination, anxiety, fears, and underestimating social and environmental factors in maintaining health. Even going back historically to earlier prenatal testing, there are some examples from the 80s and 90s of parents choosing to terminate pregnancies with sex chromosome anomalies because they were afraid of their child being homosexuals, despite there being no research connection into that at the time. People just went based on vibes and their own assumptions and the kind of child they didn't want to have. So do we risk this becoming even more prominent of an issue simply by nature of testing for more stuff? The specific debate around Down syndrome termination has been a strong one for a while, likely because it is the most common genetic disability, so it's going to come up the most here. Specifically in 2018, a bunch of articles popped up about Iceland and how it was boasting only 2 or 3 children with Down syndrome born yearly in a country with a population around 350,000 with a nearly 100% termination rate. Often children born with the condition are because they slipped through the cracks, like the initial test said their risk factors were very low, so they didn't do the second test. Based on the stories I read, it seems like that's a lot more common than it being a personal choice. And while all of these articles go on and on and on about Iceland being concerning for its sheer lack of Down syndrome, it's important to remember that Denmark has a 98% termination rate. In France, it's 77%. In Australia and the UK, it's around 90%. And in the US, it's around 74%. In Australia specifically, they've done a lot of research around issues with the neutrality of counseling with these results and pressure from the medical establishment to make certain choices. And they found that about half of the families out of a few thousand surveyed felt pressure to terminate, specifically noting that they were treated like their child's a tragedy for the remainder of their pregnancy after the diagnosis, as well as being reminded continuously multiple times at every single visit that it is their right to terminate up until birth if they so choose, even if they specifically requested it no longer be brought up again. And I also saw multiple cases of people's physicians calling them with the results and at the same time letting them know they'd already gone and scheduled the termination for them so they didn't have to handle it, without asking what they wanted or what these results might mean for their unborn child. So in addition to this concern about neutral counseling around test results, and the fact that many countries only allow late-term abortions in the case of deformity, which, to be clear, is incredibly important healthcare. I'm not suggesting these things should not be available, again, for the cases we talked about earlier, and even for this case as well. I'm just acknowledging that they have been documented as being presented in a sort of like, well, it's offered for this specific thing, so maybe you should do it. People have felt very pressured to make certain decisions. There's also a documentary called A World Without Down Syndrome about this topic that ultimately is fine. Like, I wouldn't recommend it. It kind of leans into, well, I love my child, so I think this is a really hard situation for me to process personally, which didn't feel morally or emotionally neutral in its exploration of the topic, and I don't think that worked in its favor as a documentary. But that documentary was done in the UK, and it comes with very similar stories and results to what we see from the Australia research, which lends me to believe that this is a lot more universal than in not just Australia, and also based on how the Ridgeways talked about this themselves, I am very inclined to see this as being the case in the United States, because they fit in line with a lot of the responses that we saw in the research from the UK and from Australia. Now, some things we know from Iceland and other high termination rate countries about a declining Down syndrome birth rate is that this increases the social stigma of having a disabled child, a change from something that just happens to being viewed as a failure of personal responsibility. I'm really interested to see if there is a future where we decide that somebody's choice to bring a disabled child into the world is seen as like some sort of child abuse kind of thing. I hope that never happens, because I don't think that is true, but I am curious if, as these kinds of tests are getting more common and we're talking more about these kinds of results and terminations and stuff like that, if we're going to start to skew that way. Again, I hope not, but I am interested. Iceland is also seeing a decline in support for people with Down syndrome and people knowing how to specifically work with people with Down syndrome, which inevitably silos them into certain parts of society due to inaccessibility, and it makes it harder for them to succeed in life because of the lack of support and opportunities. Not to mention the ability to meet other people like them and parents to meet other people like them, which hurts from a support system angle for these people. For wider society, the fact that people aren't seeing people with Down syndrome on the regular creates more fear-mongering and stigma around the condition, which may lead to further parent choices being made because there isn't a chance of them knowing anything different. A lot of parents who've been interviewed in various articles who chose to keep their babies with Down syndrome talked about doing it because they knew somebody with it, so they felt prepared. Without that as an option, people are going to be less likely to take that option. And if we're deciding as a society that those aren't lives worth living, what does that mean for the people who do live? And how do we treat them? And how do we talk about them? There's also more widely concern that there might be some potential of this testing and safe termination only being available to higher income countries and to higher income households, creating further major class disparities of disability. There's already major class disparities of disability, but this would become another one. And would this encourage countries with bans on pregnancy termination to begin being exceptions so they don't become one of the only countries with children with Down syndrome if it became a marker of class, for example? Now, I will say, very importantly, Down syndrome is not going to disappear, ever. Many of these genetic concerns are very, very valid, but they can tip a little bit far into the, we're gonna eradicate it, what will this mean side of it, which is not technically going to ever happen. Down syndrome has a close correlation with maternal age, and maternal age has been steadily increasing globally, so prenatal diagnoses of it are likely to rise. There will always be people who are so happy to have a baby that the idea of terminating a disabled pregnancy doesn't even cross their minds. There will always be people who choose not to get tested. There will probably always be cases where it is not detected until very late because the person was considered low risk and they decide to keep it for that reason. It's not disappearing. But that also does not mean it becoming endangered isn't a cause for concern either. The other thing that's very important is acknowledging that most of the arguments about this being concerning flip it around into, well, here are all the things that make people with Down syndrome special and useful and unique and worth having around, which is also a thing that rubs me the wrong way. I see this with neurodiversity a lot too, where people are like, see, they're important because they're useful, which feels fundamentally antithetical to disability rights work in my opinion. Disabled people deserve to exist because they're people. Not because they're useful, not because of all the positive stereotypes you can possibly come up with about their disability to try to outweigh some of the more negative things, but because human diversity is great and people deserve to be treated equally and included as a part of society. If I hear one more person say that we need a world with Down syndrome because they bring a lot of joy into everything they do, I'm gonna flip a table. Not every person with Down syndrome is happy all the time. Nobody wants to feel like they're supposed to be happy all the time. It's a weird argument. Anyway, Down syndrome is also very much the tip of the iceberg with this conversation. It's the primary one we're talking about with prenatal testing, but there are many disabled communities that are sitting in a really precarious place right now. For example, starting in the 1980s, connected with a lot of otherwise deaf-specific advocacy and activist work, cochlear implants were beginning to be widely used clinically, and since the very beginning there has been backlash about them being marketed to hearing parents who have never met another deaf person before, with information about how their child will never be able to speak or live a normal life without it. And so with the information these parents were given, many people made the choice to implant their children and remove them from a potential of being a part of the deaf community. Not knowing that it's a lot more complicated than that on a couple levels, first being that for a very, very long time, and sometimes today, but not all the time, in order to get a cochlear, you destroy any residual hearing. They don't mimic hearing in the same way that ears do, so the regret rate is higher than other elective surgeries. Also, parents of potential implantees were often instructed not to ever use ASL with their children because they then supposedly wouldn't learn to speak, which is objectively not true. But also cochlear implants used to happen around a year old. Now they can be a little bit earlier, but it means either way that these children are completely deprived of any linguistic development during their early years in life, which has severe consequences. And the increase in children getting cochlear implants and then being mainstreamed, not given any access to the deaf community, has been and continues to be a concern about the longevity of their culture, as the medical establishment still continues to view deafness as a tragedy. And it's also not just like, oh, we need to preserve deaf culture, but like, ASL is the most barrier-free method of communication for deaf people, so therefore that is what they should have access to, and they're being denied access to that because they're being forced to conform to a hearing society, and that is a concern. If you've ever dipped your toe into deaf culture, you hear stories about people being told, oh, I'm so sorry, your child is deaf, and asking why that's something to apologize for and not something to celebrate, because to them it is something to celebrate. The little people community is also in a very similar boat here. There's a recent documentary I'll have a review out for in July. It's free on the PBS website, you don't need an account. It's called The Tallest Dwarf, and it talks a lot about the functional eradication of pituitary dwarfism and the medical community's primary focus on trying to figure out how to make dwarfs taller and how to create gene therapies to fix achondroplasia rather than researching and working on better treatments for the physical things they actually struggle with, like spinal pain. They too have many stories about hearing, I'm sorry, your child appears to have dwarfism, and responding with a sigh of relief because they didn't know how they were going to manage an average height child. These are not the only examples of this where there's a clash between an existing disability community and view of something being a difference with struggles, just like everybody has struggles, versus the medical community seeing it as a tragedy and trying to fix it or mitigate the things that it thinks are the most disabling for that person, because it's easier to make a difference in an individual person's problem to manage than it is for societies to accommodate. Those are just like the two that have come off the top of my head because I've researched them both very recently. Now, interestingly with Down syndrome, there have been some attempts at US legislation in many different states to ban termination based on certain prenatal diagnoses, but all of those have failed, which is a good thing. And of course, there is a concern that the primary point of those bills was to carefully dismantle abortion rights altogether. Also very fascinating that many states want to have that bill but have no interest in trying to overturn Buck v. Bell. It's almost like they care more about controlling the bodies of folks with uteruses than they do about the chance of disabled babies being born. But at the end of the day, going back to our little case study here, any parent can make whatever choice they want. I'm not going to get mad at a person for looking at the likely somewhat biased information they're being given and looking at the fact that we have very little support systems available for parents and children in general, much less for parents of disabled children. And for disabled adults too. Even today, many supports for disabled adults are just institutionalization, just in a different font. It doesn't feel illogical to me that they might make the choice to not bring that child into the world, and I'm not gonna be mad at them for it. It makes me sad that this is the way the system is set up, because I am sure with a different support system and a lot less stigma, these choices would look a lot different, but I'm not gonna criticize a family for making this choice. The system is broken. Individuals acting out of survival within that system, doing what they think is best with the information that they have been given, aren't really at fault, nor are they committing eugenics. If anything is doing a eugenics, it's the overarching system, which by nature of the pressure that is well documented, at least based on my interpretation, categorically is eugenics. I also always get kind of weirded out when we start parsing out so-called quality of life and deciding what that means for somebody else, because there's so many disabled people I know who have much higher qualities of life than non-disabled people that I know. And deciding that in general always feels a bit like we're trying to play God. Like, these conversations came up a lot regarding triage during the early stages of the pandemic, and it just really wigged me out, particularly when it stopped being from an angle of likeliness to survive based on pre-existing conditions and leaned more toward, well, you have 2 diagnoses of something, so you're farther down the list of care than somebody else who has none. Just really is weird. We're not going to get further into the ethics of deciding based on a list of worst case scenario traits of a disability whether the fetus is worth being born, because that's a whole can of worms I can't even quite wrap my own head around to even talk about it thoroughly, but it just really, really weirds me out. What I'm trying to basically say is everybody deserves the right to choose, and they can choose, and that's fine, and I'm not going to criticize them for making a choice. I'm going to criticize the system for trying to push people to make certain choices, but I'm not going to criticize the person for making any kind of choice. That doesn't feel very fair. The other incredibly important caveat to add to this, however, is that 25 to 28% of the population is disabled, and while nobody can agree on the precise percentage of disabilities that are congenital, those numbers get complicated solely because we know many disabilities are technically congenital but are not diagnosed until fatherhood or later. It is a pretty small proportion of overall disability. So you can select all you want to not have a child born with Down syndrome, and then they might be born autistic with cerebral palsy and epilepsy. They might, God forbid, get in a car accident and have a spinal injury in elementary school. They might develop diabetes later in life or have a TBI in a skiing accident over winter break. They might have severe anxiety or depression. At the time in my life when I had the intention of having children in the future, my mindset was always assume disabled child until proven otherwise, because statistically, in my opinion, that's the most responsible thing to do, just based on what the numbers look like. I read many articles talking about arguments and discussions around the Ridgeway situation, where the phrase, if you can't take care of a disabled child, don't have children, was brought up as something horrible and awful for a person to say. But just based on the facts available, in my opinion, that is objectively the only take to have. And as much as the world of genetics keeps telling you in the future we'll be able to select out all kinds of things like autism and depression and whatnot, that's never happening. That is never going to happen. There are so many pieces of so many disabilities, both physical and mental, that are environmental, and we cannot magically make those go away with designer babies. Lots of things happen after a child is born that we cannot control. So if you want to be a parent, I do feel like you need to prepare yourself for any possible scenario. Prenatal testing may be the very first window into that possibility of other kinds of scenarios than what you were imagining, but it will not be the last. Disability is a lot more common than people think. So again, no criticism to them, no hate to them on this particular regard. I'm just saying in general, if you're thinking about having kids, this is something to just be aware of. The statistics are pretty high. So it is something you're going to need to factor in the same way that statistically you could have a queer kid, you could have a trans kid. That needs to be something you're prepared for. Otherwise, I, in my opinion, don't think you're fit to be a parent. Anyway, now where I am going to criticize the Ridgeways is I do not understand why any of this needed to be on the internet in the first place. Like, sure, there is stigma around the conversation of making this choice, and it has been documented that the people who do it feel very alone and very ashamed after the fact. And I do think maybe that's something we could try to do a little bit more something about with a lot of nuance and care and a deliberate program, but that's not what they did or how they went about it. They didn't frame this as, hey, we got bad medical news and we made a choice and we appreciate your understanding at this time. They turned it into content from start to finish, and then when he received backlash, Jesse doubled down and tripled down, and in fact quadrupled down, trying to defend their choice in increasingly ableist and uneducated and harmful ways, which not only causes harm and spreads misinformation, but also just feels supremely weird to me to air out your dirty laundry like that. Like, forgive me for sounding like an old man who's angry at the concept of the internet, but it is so important to have boundaries and keep some things to yourself. And this is definitely one of those things that I think they should not have A, shared, or B, actively monetized. Now, one other side tangent I do want to go on when we're talking about monetization before we end this conversation is that it did feel a lot like the initial intention was to pivot at least one of their channels into becoming a family channel. Simply by nature of them filming, uploading, and monetizing every single piece of the pregnancy up until this point, it felt like a transition point into baby content. And I hate to say that my first thought when I saw the story pop up was I was grateful a disabled child wasn't put in that position. Like, to be clear, hate to see any child put in that position. Vehemently against family vlogging over here. Please take your children off the internet unless they are dogs. But there is a specific phenomenon of parents of disabled children who do very, very invasive and in-depth family vlogging of their disabled child that they claim is for education purposes. And all family vlogging, again, is of course exploitative, but specifically disabled family vlogs are a direct descendant of the freak show. If you want to learn more about the history of freak shows and how they built the modern theater industry, I will link that video above for you on whichever side it's supposed to be. But many freak show exhibits or performances were just watching visibly disabled children play with their toys. Daisy and Violet Hilton, the conjoined twins you may know from the Sideshow musical, began their lives that way for the first 6 or 7 years and were greatly traumatized by it. Also, through these vlogs, often the parents, particularly the mothers, get framed by themselves as saints for dealing with all the difficulties and the tribulations of being the parent of a disabled child, and the child is just used as a prop, which isn't really a lot different from what a lot of media around disability says as well, but here it is framed as more real and true rather than a specific framed storyline, which makes it a lot more difficult to process it as media and a lot more concerning to me as somebody who specializes in disability media portrayals. We are doing a lot of work in Hollywood and on Broadway to try to make these things at least a little bit different. They're not always different, but we're trying. But then you go on YouTube and you can easily find like 15 different examples of the same harmful narratives we've been trying to have media avoid utilizing for decades, while also exploiting children. And it just hurts my heart. I do understand from like a parent perspective that parenting in and of itself is a very lonely and solitary activity, just in general, but especially with a disabled child because of stigma. And so I understand why a parent might want to frame themselves this way and create an online community. I cognitively get why this is a choice people are making, but it is just so exploitative and so icky, and I really, really don't like it. And we have enough disabled adults who can voluntarily do educational work on the internet. You do not need to exploit your child to do so, and that feels like a really weird excuse for doing this. I actually sometimes see discussions and critiques of family vlogging saying it's bad and unethical, but then see this kind of vlogging used as like an exception because it is educational, and it just really grinds my gears because it's not it's causing a lot of harm both to that child and to the wider disability community. But anyway, I think that we have just about exhausted every single angle this could possibly have taken or brought up, but I also did this entire research, writing, and filming process in a 48-hour turnaround, so perhaps I missed something. Do let me know in the comments if I did. I would really appreciate if in these comments you could focus less on this particular couple and the choices they made and more on the general disability discussion we talked about today. I don't want to pile on them in any regard. They have been through enough already. I may disagree with their choice to put all this online and sort of feel like responses to it might just be consequences for actions, but I also know how scary it is to have the internet come at you in a big way, and I don't wish that on anybody. So I don't want to contribute to that in any way. If I can, if we can, I would appreciate that discretion in your comments. This has just brought up a lot of adjacent discussions that I think are interesting and important to be having and to be bringing up while we're having this more general pop culture conversation. Again, sources are linked below, along with my Patreon if you want early access to what I'm up to. Again, I make everything a month in advance, so if you join the top tier, you can have all that a month in advance. Mandatory like, comment, subscribe, whatever sparks joy, to tell the algorithm that you like being here so you can come back. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is so very sexy, as is understanding systemic issues before we attack individuals trying to function within those systems. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one, which will be a lot about deaf culture and abusive relationships and a really famous movie, so you might want to stick around for that. Okay, bye!